It's my pleasure to introduce you to Michael Frost. Mike's a great guy. I first heard Mike, oh my gosh, it must have been 15 years ago at Sindel Baptist. He might not even remember. He wouldn't even know I was in the crowd. But I went to church in Melbourne one night, and they had this guy called Michael Frost, and I'd never heard him before. And I was blown away. I came away, and I saw a man who had a huge passion for Jesus Christ, and it was around Easter time, so he brought the Easter message. And I'd never heard it expressed in that way, and it hit me in the eyes. And I've heard him at a number of youth events around Aussie and even a few over here. And I got a lot of time for this guy. He's written a great book. And so why don't you give your hand to Michael as he's going to come up tonight and share with us. So I'll hand over to Michael.
G'day. Kia ora. All right. Thank you. That was a really lovely introduction. Thanks. Aussies always put each other down when they introduce each other, so I was kind of bracing myself for something kind of rude and disrespectful. And he's from Queensland, so they're even ruder up there. So he surprised us all here. This is fantastic. I'm going to pray, not because enough people haven't already prayed, but I'd just like to pause and acknowledge Christ's presence in this moment. So let's bow together. Father, I ask now that, Lord, you would ensure the words that I speak are acceptable in your sight. You are our Lord and our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to lead into what I want to share with you tonight by telling you a story of something that happened to me last summer, last Southern Hemisphere summer, because it's actually a Northern Hemisphere story. In February, I think it was, I went to speak at a missional church conference in Montreal, and that meant going from about 30 or 35 degrees in Sydney to about minus 10 or minus 15 in Montreal. And turned up, flew into Montreal, and I don't know if any of you, or how many of you have ever been to Montreal before, but aside from being incredibly cold at minus 10 or minus 15 degrees, this is kind of like the city of churches, really. There's one on every street corner. And I'm not talking about like little wooden country churches like Kristen has painted for us, but I'm talking about like magnificent, beautiful churches, huge crosses reaching up into the sky. And right above Montreal on a hill called Mount Royal, which is the smallest mountain, I think, in the world. It's more like a hill, but Hill Royal doesn't sound quite as spectacular. So on Mount Royal, which is where you get the word Montreal from, there is this gigantic a neon cross that can be seen from just about anywhere you are in the city of Montreal. So I turn up in this kind of white and snow-covered, beautiful town, covered with crosses and gigantic churches, with this huge neon cross almost kind of floating in the night sky. And I thought, wow, well, I've landed in Christendom. I mean, this is the place to be. The conference is being held in a hotel. And I was staying in the hotel, and the best I could ever get to see of Montreal was just looking out the window of my room, because the conference was in the conference room and the meals were in the restaurant of the hotel. And because my schedule in the early part of this conference was so busy, I didn't even kind of get to go outside. And so I was sitting, I think it was morning tea or afternoon tea or lunch or something, and I got talking to a guy called Ron, who's a kind of a youth worker, a street worker. He works in a kind of a youth and homeless crisis refuge and soup kitchen kind of place. He's a Quebecois, French-speaking Canadian, very proud of Montreal, thinks it's a fantastic city, and he says to me, so what do you think of our city? As everyone does when you visit their city, incidentally. A number of people at Palmerston North have asked me the same thing. And I said, it reminds me a lot of Montreal, really. And So he says, so what do you think of our city? We're very proud of Montreal. And I said, well, I have to actually be honest with you. I said, I haven't even stepped foot outside the hotel once I've arrived here. All my business has been inside this building. And he was aghast at this. And he said, well, when do you actually get some time off? And I said, later this afternoon, I'm not doing anything in the session that's scheduled after lunch or whatever it happened to be. And he said, well, look, I'll skip out of that session. Would you allow me to show you around my city of Montreal? It would be my honour, he said, in a kind of very sort of French, flourishy kind of way. And I said, oh, monsieur, it would be my honour to be shown around. And so he said, look, put on your warmest clothing and meet me in the lobby at, such and such a time. So sure enough, I get back up to my room, get my jacket, my jumper, and get on my beanie, and I'm all rugged up, and I go down into the lobby, and I meet him, and he says, oh, hi. I said, but I told you you had to put your warm clothes on to go out. And I said, but these are all the warmest clothes that I've got, and it was like, sacre bleu. So, he's got to run off and borrow thermonuclear warming clothes, It's like, I've got thermal this and all these layers. I walked out of the hotel like this, And so we walk out into kind of like -10 to Montreal. And we head down, we're going to go about like 10 or 15 blocks down to the river, and that's where Old Montreal, that's the real French bit that you've got to see. So come with me, he says, and off we go. And of course, he's a street worker. He works on the streets among the homeless and with the poor. So he's pointing out all these things as we're walking through what was kind of sort of CBD kind of territory. We hadn't gone maybe more than sort of 6 blocks, I suppose. We might be halfway to where we're meant to be. And even with all this gear on, my ears are starting to ache and my fingers are hurting already. I mean, I've never known temperatures like... I've skied in your country and mine, and even in Vancouver, but never known anything quite as cold as this. So I thought my nose would drop off. I was actually, frankly, worried about it. And we get kind of halfway to where we're meant to be, which is Old Montreal, and we see a guy standing out on the street panhandling, and he's standing outside of Tim Hortons. If you've ever been to Canada, you won't know that's kind of like Canadian version of Starbucks, and they're everywhere. So he's standing at Tim Hortons with a Tim Hortons coffee cup, panhandling for money. And he looked like a classic 1970s punk, and I grew up in the 1970s, so I know what they look like. He's got the big spiky head mohawk, shaved around the sides. He's got a battered, cracked, broken, torn, studded leather jacket. He's got a black Cure T-shirt on. He's got black jeans torn at the knees and at the buttocks. He's got knee-high studded leather boots that were coming away from the soles. Now, can you imagine what you'd be feeling like at -15 degrees wearing something like this? His nose was red raw, his ears were red, his nose was continually dripping. I mean, he must have been freezing. He'd wrapped his feet in plastic bags and put them in his boots to try and keep them dry as he walked through the snow. And here he was, freezing outside Hortons, shaking a coffee cup. So Ron, who works with the homeless, walks up to him, or you couldn't but walk by him, walks up to him and introduces himself. Hi, he says, I'm a street worker. He said, how long have you been in town? And they get talking about how he's come up from Toronto and he's been here for 6 months. And where are you living? Oh, I'm squatting in an abandoned warehouse over here, he's saying. And explained how he'd kind of built this false floor out of debris wood so that the rats can run underneath him while he's sleeping. And he'd kind of hooked up an electric cord to a building next door. He was stealing electricity for a little kind of bar radiator that he'd found from somewhere. And Ron's telling him all about where you can get a meal here and you get a bed there, and some of this stuff the kid knew about. He was about 21. His name was Alex. So Alex saying, yeah, I've heard of that. No, I didn't know that. And so they're kind of sharing all this inside kind of street information. Now, I can't contribute very much to this conversation, as you can imagine. And at this point, I was sure my nose was just about to drop off. So I said, look, excuse me. I said, pardon me for interrupting, but I said, can you think of one good reason why we don't have this conversation like inside Tim Hortons, where it's nice and warm? And Alex says, oh, no, he said, I can't go in there. He said, I've already been kicked out 2 or 3 times. I was trying to get warm in there earlier. He said, if I go back in, they're going to call the cops. And I said, yeah, but I said, if I took you in there and I bought you a cup of coffee, I said, they couldn't kick you out for that. He said, yeah. He said, no, I couldn't do that. He said, you see, I don't drink coffee. I said, well, actually, I don't really drink much coffee either. I said, but if I just bought a few coffees and put them on the table, we wouldn't have to drink them, but we would be paying for the table, right? And this kid who's squatting in an abandoned warehouse and stealing electricity from the house next door said, oh, he said, but that wouldn't be very ethical since I don't drink coffee.